Good evening. I'm so glad to be with all of you here tonight for the commemorative lecture of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I do have a couple of announcements though, so I thought I would make those. Let's see, which way shall we start? Oh, we should start by saying our name. I'm Altagracia Perez Bullard. I am an assistant professor of practical theology here at Virginia Theological Seminary and the associate dean of multicultural ministries. And it is my pleasure to gather us tonight for this wonderful opportunity to listen to Dr. Vandiver. So here are the announcements. They're like all over the place, but tomorrow's Eucharist, the 5:15 Eucharist, the last thing that happens is that there is a photo of the student body. And so please be present so that you can be in the picture and it can be proven that indeed you went here this year. So just so that you know, just a reminder that is happening at the end of the Eucharist. Because it is like activities 2 evenings in a row that would not normally happen, the Associate Dean for Student Life, Dean Sam, is offering assistance with childcare. She's not offering you the childcare person. She is offering you some money so that you could pay a childcare person for tomorrow evening. And she says to please just contact her directly. And she will be glad to assist in covering those costs. You will receive an email this evening from me that is some sampling of reflection questions that you might use tomorrow morning during your formation groups and colloquy groups to have a conversation, a discussion, a reflection on tonight's lecture. So you can watch out for that. Those of you who like paper, I have hard printed some and we'll be distributing them at the end of tonight's session. And those questions are just meant to be helpful. If you all show up and you have a lot of things to talk about, you don't have to worry with the questions at all. I think those are the things. So let's take a moment and pray before I introduce our Dean and President, who will have a few words of welcome. So this prayer is attributed to the Church of the Province of the West Indies in one of their prayer books. And it is found in Phyllis Tickle's The Divine Hours for Eastertide for this season. And so let us pray. Almighty God, our Heavenly Father, the privilege is ours to share in the loving, healing, reconciling mission of your Son, Jesus Christ, our Lord, in this age and wherever we are. Since without you we can do no good thing, may your Spirit make us wise, may your Spirit guide us, may your Spirit renew us, may your Spirit strengthen us, so that we will be strong in faith, discerning in proclamation, courageous in witness, persistent in good deeds. This we ask through the name of the Father. Amen. And so I'd like to welcome Dean Ian Mark, our Dean and President, to come and give a few words of welcome.
Thank you very much, Altagracia. It is a joy to welcome you all here this evening, and a special privilege to welcome a friend of the seminary, a Martha Horn visiting professor of the seminary, and an esteemed colleague in ministry, and you'll hear more about that introduction in just a moment. I just want to say a few very short remarks. Virginia Theological Seminary simply mandates the class chapel lunch ritual, which you all know about. You're supposed to go to classes. You're required to participate in table fellowship in lunch, and you participate in one corporate act of worship. And then we try as much as possible to send a signal that anything you do on top of that, you're choosing to do. So deanery evenings aren't required, lectures aren't required. You know, we try to make it clear that you're empowered to pick and choose what you really would like to do. The one exception is this occasion. And this is important. And the reason why it's important is because we're seeing the dismantling of the DEI framework that was a significant key step in progress as we as a nation sought to come to terms with our past with the goal of making the present different, with the goal of making the future hopeful. And what we're doing as a seminary tonight is, in a small way, a symbol of resistance and a witness that there is a need for the continuing commemoration of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr., our participation in this work. And I'm deeply grateful to the Reverend Dr. Altagracia Perez-Bullard, this is her first MLK event. Let's just recognize Altagracia, please. And we will continue to do this because what it represents is vitally important. So I hand the baton back to Altagracia to introduce our speaker. Before I do so, I am just going to pause and recognize that we're really pleased that we have the very Reverend Kim L. Coleman, the National President of the Union of Black Episcopalians, which itself is also another important part of our work as an institution. We're delighted we have their office on the campus. We're delighted that we have their presence. I invite you please to stand so we can recognize Kim Coleman.
So I will say the formal things for the record, and then I'll say some informal things. The Reverend Dr. Kevin Vandiver is the Martha Horn Visiting Professor during this academic year here at Virginia Theological Seminary. He also serves as a senior pastor at Lutheran Church of the Reformation in Washington, D.C., and holds a PhD in practical theology with a specialty in homiletics from Princeton Theological Seminary. Many of you have already enjoyed him because he's been teaching here this fall and spring, and so I've heard many good reports. He is, by his own definition in some of his bios, right, he has a passion and a call for all of the ministries that have been given to him. So he's a pastor of a church, he's a scholar and a teacher, he's a husband and a father, and most of all, he has a passion for the last, lost, and least, and believes that God's love is lavishly offered as free gift to all. And I had the good fortune of meeting Kevin when both of us were serving in New York City. I was the canon for congregational vitality for the Episcopal Diocese of New York. And Kevin was working in Harlem doing a redevelopment of a congregation, a historic congregation in that community. And we met and became immediate fast friends because we could talk about all just what it entails and what it takes to take a historic congregation that has a great legacy and that seeks to be of service, but is now dealing with, deferred maintenance in its building, dealing with, many much older members, dealing with completely, this is not the Harlem of our youth, right? A completely different experience in the community in terms of who lives there and what their goals and hopes are. And so we were able to share a whole lot before he went to Princeton to live out his scholarly call. And the gift that is for us is that we're in the midst of some times that take the best of our minds and the best of our faith and the best of our heart, but also the ability to learn from people who have worked and been in the trenches where reality is. And so I'm so very grateful that you all have the opportunity tonight to hear from Dr. Kevin Vandiver, who has exactly that combination that is so not that common in the academy. So we're so great that you're with us and glad to welcome you to the podium.
Thank you. Praise the Lord, everybody. How y'all doing tonight? It's good to be here with all of you. A lot has already been said about me, but I just want to take this first little moment to say thank you. Thank you to Dr. Markham and Dr. Knowles, in her absence, I'm presuming, for extending the invitation for me to be here. I have found that being the Martha Horn visiting professor has been very much a joy, and the students here at Virginia Theological are very serious, very good, very wonderful students. I'm not looking at you. I know you're in here. Some of the students that I've taught are already in the room, so it also means a lot to me that you all are here. I'd like to also thank Acting Dean Kane for helping to shepherd me through this, and some of my colleagues with whom I've gotten to work with pretty closely are Dr. Hook, Dr. Lamboulay, Dr. Fentress-Williams, and Dr. Perez-Bullard. This lecture tonight is going to be a safe space, but it's also going to be warm in terms of it may make you feel uncomfortable at times. It may make you feel uncomfortable at times, but as Dr. Markham has said, one small act of resistance is for us to gather and try to tell a little bit of truth tonight. Okay? I'm going to treat this like a class, so you can talk back to me. It's not going to be all highbrow, all of this stuff with the lecturing. Sorry, I'm not trying to offend you by speaking in a British accent. But I hope that you will see this as a communal engagement together. So the first thing I'm going to do is show us a little video. So this is a Dove commercial, and I don't know if any of you remember this, but this was a commercial that came out it's been a couple decades since this came out. And this is less about, tonight, a discussion about aesthetics. What I want to start to seed is what happens when distortions become the norm by which we live. How do we form our norms, the way we live and move through the world, based off distortions? So distortion is an act of twisting or altering something out of its true natural or original state. And we can truly think of distortions also as interpretations that may go awry. So I have to concede my weakest point. Because if you're thinking about life as interpretation, you cannot necessarily decide what interpretation is true all the time. So I'm conceding that when you want to ask your questions at the end. But I still want to home in on this idea of distortion, this notion of distortion, and how we see it playing out in our world. We see, do y'all know what this is? This is the National Museum for African American History and Culture. It was opened in 2016. It's been one of the cities, I live in DC, one of the city's top draws and one of the world's top African American museums. On March 27th, 2025, an executive order titled Restoring Truth and Sanity to American History was released, where according to a Reuters article dated on the 28th of March, it suggests Trump is seeking to purge elements of what conservatives view as a revisionist history of the United States that places systemic racism at the heart of its narrative. The order singles out the National Museum of African American History and Culture as problematic, claiming that it informs visitors that hard work, individualism, and the nuclear family are aspects of white culture. Ouch. Don't mention the fact that you subjected the people that came over not on cruise ships, but on slave ships to chattel slavery for hundreds of years without the expectation that some of that traumatic action on an entire group of people would affect them in ways untold. That wasn't in the executive order. This represents a distortion. They said that this museum, along with others, represented anti-American ideology, but it's really a distortion. This is from an ABC News article. Do y'all know who this is? This is Senator Barack Obama, Reverend Jeremiah Wright. He don't look like that anymore, does he? Neither one of them really. Okay. So this was Barack Obama's pastor for 20 years. And right around 2008, there was a clip that was circulating all over the news, everywhere you looked, on a sermon snippet of Dr. Wright saying, GD America. I'm not going to say it because I don't know who's watching. But, you know, it was just, they just kept playing it over and over and over again, to the point where Barack Obama ended up saying about Dr. Wright that he's just one of those, what does it say, is like an old uncle that says things that I don't always agree with. Really taking away the weight of who Dr. Wright was and removing him and what he said from the context of the work that he had done in the south side of Chicago. This represents a distortion. Norming distortions can be dangerous. Places can be distorted, situations can be distorted, and even people can be distorted. I thought this was about Martin Luther King. When are you going to start talking about Martin Luther King? Here we go. This is a King lecture, so we should be talking about Dr. Martin Luther King. So we're staying with this theme of distortion. Are you with me? Amen. Okay, let's watch this.
Republicans have been doing a thing where they piously defend their partisan calculated war on history by invoking the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. They repurpose his words to use them as a shield when defending their Jim Crow era war on facts. Take a look.
You're hearing a lot about critical race theory. So what is it? This is a form of teaching that teaches our kids that America is systemically racist and that you're either an oppressor or a victim, and judge a person by the color of their skin, not the content of their character.
As the Reverend Dr. King famously said, and he was right, we should judge our fellow citizens by the content of their character, not by the color of their skin. Mr. President, we need a strong nation with strong citizens who see each other as Americans, not as oppressors or oppressed.
Critical race theory goes against everything Martin Luther King has ever told us. Don't judge us by the color of our skin. And now they're embracing it, right? They're going backwards.
In doing so, they dismiss and diminish the breadth of Dr. King's actual work and teachings. What they fail to note is that throughout his life, Dr. King spoke regularly about eradicating racism, militarism, and poverty. He called for just and equitable housing. He demanded that people be provided a livable wage and called for an end to healthcare disparities. And finally, and most enduringly, he worked to prevent voter suppression. A mission that remains just as urgent today as it was in 1963 because of the modern Republican Party. You see, it's easy to invoke a few lines that you memorized in high school from a speech, but it's a lot harder to hear the totality of his message. If they actually dug a little deeper or read a little more than just the cliff notes of his work, they would know that Dr. King also said, and I'll quote, "It is obvious if a man is entered at the starting line in a race 300 years after another man, the first would have to perform some impossible feat to catch up with his fellow runner," unquote. What modern day Republicans willfully ignore in their revisionist history of King is that when he was alive, he was demonized, surveilled, and accused of being, wait for it, a communist. Sound familiar? What Kevin and his fellow Republicans might want to consider are a few other words from one of the Reverend's sermons. Quote, "Nothing in all the world is more dangerous than sincere ignorance and conscientious stupidity." I'm joined now by Dr. Bernice A. King, CEO of the King Center and the daughter of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I'm so excited to have you on, Dr. King, and I want to ask you
so much.
Well, I follow you on Twitter, and I love every time you just lovingly rebuke these people who really, in my mind, pervert the meaning of your father's words for their own purposes. How does it feel for you as his daughter to hear his name invoked in defense of refusing to teach history?
Well, I mean, come on. It is insulting. At one point in my life, I got really upset until I understood, the essence of what my father said in the quote you just mentioned about nothing more dangerous than sincere ignorance and conscientious stupidity. I feel that I, along with my brother and those who represent this legacy, have a responsibility to continue to educate people on the truth of my father. You've done an excellent job at everything you just said about the fact that he was devoted to eradicating the triple evils of poverty, racism, and militarism. And while he invoked those words at the end of his speech, I encourage people to read the whole speech. I think there's a danger to reading the last part. He was a preacher. Preachers will lay out conditions and circumstances and challenges, and at the end, they want to leave you with a sense of hope. That was the hope part of his speech. We hope that my children will live in this nation where they will be judged by the color of the content of character and not the color of their skin. But we're not dismissing the fact that there are these conditions that he talked about during the I Have a Dream speech concerning the Black community that have to be addressed. He would never encourage us to ignore the conditions and not to put forth the effort to address them. But he would also encourage us to study the whole context of history.
Yes.
He did that, and where do we go from here? He laid out how we got to where we are. And so Daddy would never say, excuse the history and let's just start here. You said it so excellent what he said when you start behind the race. He also said, if a nation has done something against the people for hundreds of years, then it must also turn around and do something for those people. I would suggest, although he did not use the words reparations, he was suggesting reparations. Now, what that looks like practically is a whole nother discussion. And so, that's why I always say, do not take excerpts from my father. Study him holistically.
That's enough. You get the point, right? I can't stand going into a Martin King something, Martin King commemoration, Martin King this or that, and hearing people, can't we all just get along? Because that's what Dr. King would have wanted us to do. Distilling Dr. King from his contextual reality. I can't stand it. And here you have his own daughter saying that this is a reality that needs to be tackled. Many folks who use woke with contempt today probably would have hated Daddy when he was alive. He was very conscious and committed to eradicating what he called the triple evils of racism, poverty, and militarism. If you're quoting him to stop truthful teaching about him, then you got the picture. What's happening is these distortions are serving a greater purpose of removing truth and reality as we understand it from its contextual moorings to a point where we create this universalizing tendency where the individual's rights and the individual's personhood no longer matters and is subsumed into the larger project of empire. There's a word for it. I'm not going to say it because I don't want you to turn your ears off. But subsuming the individual in favor of creating this empire-rich imperial narrative of everything is just fine. So that distortion we see with the museum. We see that distortion with the words of Dr. King being taken out of context. And we continue to see that distortion every time you turn around with each pressing order that marginalizes a body of people for whatever reason. I'm not preaching, I'm just talking loud, okay? Are you with me? Okay, so the question we have to ask ourselves is, how do we deal with these distortions? How do we deal with these universalizing tendencies and tactics of empire? What do we do with them? And in the midst of a divided world, moving us toward these tactics and tendencies, shall distortions rule the day? So I named this lecture, We Are at an Impasse. It was from the 1967 Massey Lectures, which Martin King gave for the Canadian Broadcasting Company. And it was actually entitled The Impasse on Race Relations. But the statement feels clear. He was talking about race relations, but we can go beyond that. We are at an impasse in many areas. And so what is at least one tool that we can take from his life tonight? So the preacher King, he was born January 15th, 1929. He was educated at Morehouse, furthered his education at Crozier Seminary and Boston University. He was a second-generation preacher. He was exposed to white Protestantism at Crozier Seminary, even white liberalism, one could say, the theology of which helped him convey his own ideas. So it gave him a packaging by which he could communicate his ideas. His context matters, though. So I'm taking this work from The Preacher King, which was on the last slide, written by Rick Lisher, who depicts Martin King as an exemplary preacher, an exemplar of a figure who speaks to all of America from his own particularity. From the outset of Lisher's work, he immediately orients Martin Luther King's giftedness and homiletical genius in his blackness, and more specifically, the black church. Lisher argues The King's formation in the black church is pivotal to his success. The heritage of suffering, which is well known to blacks, forced deportation, enslavement, poverty, segregation, and estrangement, always in tension with God's purpose for the whole world, but especially the marginalized. King was groomed in a setting where preachers spoke for God. The black church provided the impetus by which there was possibility for King, even as he lived as a marginalized black man in America, where he felt the barbs of injustice in the world outside the walls of the black church. The black church itself, with some correctives, represents a place of democratic spirit. This reality of blackness and being formed in blackness provides the foundation. He can in no way be divorced from that blackness. Neither can he shrink or set aside his black self for the sake of the gospel. For King and those who mentored him, the gospel is carried by those who are decidedly black and marginalized. And this conviction and experience cannot be distorted. It's difficult to distort. So how did he do it? So basically, we're saying that he got his education in liberal white institutions, but he was formed in the black church tradition. So the black church tradition, the black preaching tradition, was the vehicle by which he moved his ideas through. And so he would have topoi and stock preaching formulas. How many of you were raised in the black church? They hung him high, they stretched him wide. He hung his head for, that's not how the story ends, but in 3 days he what? That's topoi, stock formulas, things that we all know when we enter into a black church. First given honor. Okay, you got it? You got it? So a wheel in the middle of a, okay, you there. All right, all right. Okay, you can keep your cards, all right? So, in terms of how he moved this vehicle forward, he had the stock preaching formulas of which we are familiar, those of us who were inculcated in that environment, use of high soaring rhetoric, a lot of poetry. He employed a lot of metaphor, rhythm and cadence, and he was contextually aware. So he borrowed those topoi from his tradition. With his lofty language and ability to bring pleasure with his speech, he was able to appeal to the highest ideals in both black folks and white folks. He would change his speech depending upon where he was, because some folks who are not inculcated in that space wouldn't know what you're talking about. Off topic a little bit. I was at one of my members' houses, and they were white, and we had dinner. Marcy, my wife, and I were at the table, and we had dinner. And it was delicious. And I said, you really put your foot in this. And the husband was like, never heard that before. What do you mean by that, Pastor? Should we take it back? Are you worried? Is there something wrong with it? No, that just is a good. So he would change his language based on his contextual reality, okay? And that's just good preaching advice for anybody if you're preaching. Know your context. Know where you're going and to whom you're preaching. But this is not a preaching class. All right. So we're thinking about his taking this liberal education, liberalism, and then packaging it in the black affect. And we would ask the question, Audre Lorde talks about, you can't use the master's tools to tear down the master's house. One may take issue with his usage of this education, which was decidedly white, but when he used the genius of who he was as a preacher and ran that liberal education through the sieve of his being as a black preacher, with all of the things that meant as a person, having lived as a black man in America at the time, it transformed that liberal education into something else. You get it? So don't shirk your education. It comes through the particularity of ourselves, and it becomes something altogether different. So through his brilliance and through his preaching prowess, everything changed. His version of the signifying game is to articulate the values of white liberalism, which he has thoroughly internalized, but in his own black voice. And this black voice, imbued with this irony, judgment, and genuine hope of the black gospel, modifies liberal values even as it articulates them. It exposes their provisional nature. It doesn't always hold up all the way by itself, but when I take it and bring it through the sieve, it has new life. Make sense? Okay. So he would use Homeric epithets. He would use borrowed formulas and poems in terms of style. His first principle was achievement of pleasure through high rhetoric. Rhetorical pleasure can move resistant people. For King, delight was an ingredient of the gospel, a la Cicero. King had a gift of seeing and elevating the mundane through the usage of this metaphor. This elevated speech was married with the black tradition, namely black trademarks in preaching. It's hard to distort a unique melding of experiences and abilities. Are you with me? Okay. So Martin King represents a word to and for America. We know that since King preached both the same materials to blacks and whites, he wasn't trying to ingratiate himself to white people, and we need to say that. It wasn't about ingratiating himself. He was sending, with the tools that he had, a message to all of America. His particular gifts were his ability to mutate and adapt what he was saying, given to the demands of a particular audience at the time. He showed dexterity with near-memorized formulas. He paid attention to his performance, cultural milieu, and style. His oratory was employed to build public consensus. And Lisher rightly states that King's speech elevated things to moral proportions, for both blacks and whites minimized or blunted the immediate harshness of the realities which people faced. His ultimate oratorical recipe was pleasure, identification, confrontation. Pleasure, identification, confrontation. Let me tell you how beautiful things are. We hold these truths to be self-evident. All people are created equal. But unfortunately, America has written a check that we can't cash. I'm paraphrasing. And we're here to bring that check that bounced for insufficient funds back to the one who wrote it. Confrontation. Make sense? All right? So with this kind of speaking across different groups, he needed to gain credibility because some blacks did not agree with King because they felt like he was pushing too hard and too fast. Others did not like nonviolent direct action. So to convince blacks, King had to identify with both black struggle and black rage. He also had to show whites that the aims of the civil rights movement fit their own ideas. He identified with that liberal education, the movement with mainstream religious and cultural values. No, you said it, not me, right? I'm sorry. But this is what he would do. And this is how his education helped him to speak this truth to power, okay? And then Martin King shows up in his body. We cannot distill or take or pull him out of his context because he was preaching in a body. He showed up bodily. Though he spoke to both black and white people, he was a black man talking to both white and black America. He campaigned for identification as a man of dark color in one of the most color-obsessed nations in the world. He struck a balance with his methods of identification, which maintained both his roots and his supporters, while also enabling him to call white people to account. It's hard to distort the reality of a body. I'm giving you a bunch of threads. I'm going to tie them together in just a second, all right? And so we're going to now back up a little bit more generally to talk about black preaching. That is my specialty, and I'm a homiletician. So we know, as Bernice King said, his daughter, he was a preacher. What does that mean more broadly for our contextual considerations? Do I have time to show this? No, I don't have time to show you this. It's okay. Basically, he's saying things are bad, okay? I'll play a little bit of it. It's only fair. All right, just a little bit. Don't say that. Okay, here we go. You don't mean that.
I'm worried about America. Yeah. I'm worried about our nation because it's sick with racism still. Just think about the fact that we live in a nation which was founded on the principle that all men are created equal. And yet men are still arguing over whether the color of a man's skin determines the content of his character. And I believe that the Lord told me to say to the United States of America that is sick with militarism and is sick with excessive materialism. Have you ever thought about it? There are between 38 and 50 million people in the United States of America who are poverty-stricken, making incomes less than the poverty level. And yet, this is the richest nation in the history of the world. Our national gross product this year will go beyond $800 billion. And yet there are between 38 and 50 million people who are poverty-stricken. Now, there's something wrong. A lot of people are afraid to say it. But I don't mind saying it. You see, somebody said to me the other night, don't you think, Dr. King, you are going to have to start speaking more in terms of the administration's policy? Because since you started talking against the war in Vietnam, it's hurt the budget of your organization, and people who once respected you don't respect you anymore. And I had to look over and say, sir, I'm sorry, but you don't know me. I'm not a consensus leader. I don't determine what is right and wrong by looking at the budget of my organization. And I don't determine what is right and wrong by taking a Gallup poll of the majority opinion. And so because there's something wrong, our struggle must continue. And what we must see is that our nation's summers of riots are caused by our nation's winters of delay.
My. You heard him for yourself. You could hear the music in this voice and the cadence and the flow and the form, but it's informed by these ideas that he has gained, that he's pulling through that sieve of particularity. Make sense? All right, I'm glad I showed it to you. So when we think about this black preacher, the black preacher rises from trauma. This is a quote by Mari Stevens, who is a professor also of trauma studies. At its base is the notion that trauma is not simply a concept that describes particularly overwhelming events, nor is it simply a category that holds people who have been undone by such events, but it is a cultural object whose function produces particular types of subjects and predisposes specific affect flows that it then manages and ultimately shunts into political projects of various types. Trauma does not describe, trauma makes. Trauma as an instrument of some sort that makes subjects, creates subjects, a cultural object which makes particular, makes up, isn't that what it says? Okay. So trauma is negative in that there is an event that causes deleterious effects on psyches and bodies. It is disruptive, confounding, of demonic power, and it unmakes worlds. Trauma disorients time and space. Trauma is a rupture. So you can run down the history. Chattel slavery, convict leasing programs. If you don't know what I'm talking about, you're just gonna have to look it up because I'm about to run out of time. Jim and Jane Crow. Let me back up. Reconstruction before that. Reconstruction hopes dashed. The rise of Jim and Jane Crow. The cradle to prison pipeline. And so on and so forth represent a rupturing of a people. And so the black preacher who rises as a subject who has been inculcated over generations, I like inculcated, by this reality. Make sense? I'm not preaching. Another quote, Eddie Glaude. For much of our national history, we have struggled mightily with the issue of race. The evil of slavery shadowed the birth of this country. Precious ideas like all men are created equal were congenitally deformed by the idea that some people are valued less than others because of the color of their skin. The value gap was baked into one of the foundational principles of this country. That struggle, at least since 1876, when the nation turned its back on the possibility of a multiracial democracy with the end of Reconstruction, has been a part of who we are as a nation. We wrestle like Jacob with the lived contradiction, not between beliefs and practices, but between and within the beliefs themselves. Trauma. And this trauma, there is some hope. In this trauma, there is some hope because there's also an upheaval. With the proper application of technique and perseverance of survivors, their resilience, integration, orientation, and ordered sociality will return. This vision of trauma, our popular and clinical imagining of the concept, is a heroic narrative. At the same time, that overwhelming event split the past off from the present by unmaking rituals of the familiar that promise timelessness. The concept of trauma and its theorizations suggest a futurity, and in doing so, put history back on track, bringing always the undoing and always the promise. The demon trauma names is neither evil nor beneficent, but simply a force of superficial upheaval. Our conventional understandings of trauma promise to bring the overwhelming, the numinous, the maddening, and the ruining under control and into management by providing a narrative of and for understanding. Now, he says a lot, but what I want to pull out of here is the possibility that in the midst of trauma comes the possibility of an upheaval which can get these things back on track. He says here that trauma is neither negative or positive, and I can't get with him on that. I argue with him in my own work. But what we want to focus on is the upheaval nature that trauma brings toward something of possibility of maybe transformation. Okay? Stevens is suggesting that trauma is a neutral force that upends everything. It serves as a vehicle for creating new pathways, gesturing towards new directions of inquiry and terrains of reflection. Trauma creates subjects, and it does so without regard to previous demographic barriers and even links otherwise disparate people groups together. Maybe you can see where I'm starting to go. Upheaval towards transformation, not guaranteed. Because sometimes trauma just sucks, excuse my language. And there is no redeeming quality behind it. But sometimes it represents the possibility of upheaval towards transformation. Okay? The best of the black preaching tradition presents us with that possibility to emulate a tradition that broke through distortions to a better approximation for liberty and justice for all. Did that make sense? The best of black preaching, where rather than be a slave, I'll be buried in my grave. And you told me that I, as a slave, need to be obedient to my master. But I have found, beyond that distortion, that in Christ there is neither slave nor free, Jew nor Greek, pushing past that distortion. The black preacher, I'm yelling, but the black preacher emerges out of the traumatic upheaval with possibility. You with me? We're talking about Martin Luther King, all right? All right? Out of the huts of history, shame, I rise. Up from a past that's rooted in pain, I rise. I'm a black ocean leaping and wide, welling and swelling. I bear in the tide, leaving behind nights of terror and fear. I rise into a daybreak that's wondrously clear. I rise, bringing the gifts that my ancestors gave. I am the dream and the hope of the slave. I rise. From this upheaval comes the black preacher and possibility. So what is distinctive about the black preacher? Being a preaching professor, oh, there was just something about that sermon. It was just so full of energy. It was just so full of verve and vigor and vitality. And that thing you did at the end was that music. There's so much music in your voice. That's what we often hear, right? Everything about the distinctiveness of black preaching. It's just so loud. But in terms of thinking about in terms of thinking about black preaching, though, black preaching is not a monolith. In terms of the performative affect, it is not monolithic. You can hear a little bit of everything in terms of style, but there's something else. And Cleo LaRue, my doctoral advisor, says it's not an issue of affect or style, although you can attach some of those stylistic traits to black preaching. But that is not the heart of black preaching, okay? The distinctiveness of black preaching is hermeneutic in nature, hermeneutical in nature, that is, interpretational, okay? It deals with certain interpretational realities, the best of it. It concerns itself with social justice concerns, care for the soul, personal piety, maintenance of the institutional church, corporate concerns, okay? That's what makes it particular. Now I'm going to try to pull all these threads together. This is the church I pastor. From Slave to Savior, a paradigm for black preaching in white spaces. That was the name of my dissertation. This church was founded in 1869. I'm the first black preacher to occupy that pulpit. Some people said, oh, you just a DEI hire. And the story is told about this church that J. Edgar Hoover's mom was a member there, and he was also a member. And during a service, they let a black preacher just bring a prayer at the end of a worship or some kind of service. He walked out, J. Edgar Hoover did, and never came back. And it's really interesting to see, the relationship between Hoover and King and talking about this tonight, right? So bringing the gifts that my ancestors gave, I preach in a trauma-informed body as a black American with the genius of the craft that I have inherited, with the learning that I have gained, and it leads us all into transformation from that place of particularity. I take what I've been given, I run it through the sieve of my heart and mind, and when I do that on my terms, as a black man in America, as Dr. King did, I both audit the space, calling it into account, and I bring we together to a third place of transformation, okay? It only works if we hold on to our particularities. Because if I get rid of all this stuff that formed me, particularly as a minoritized person, I can bring the stuff through, but it'll sound like what they've always heard. From my particularity as a minoritized body, bringing this stuff through comes the upheaval, which opens up into the possibility of transformation, where we come together as community. So here we're tying the threads together. Particularity can combat distortions. Imago Dei. God puts the DEI in Imago Dei. So a lot of times these lectures are way up in the clouds, aren't they? Yeah. Well, what does that mean for those of us who are in the chairs? Wait a minute. I'll tell you in a second. Because I realize that this is just one possibility, right? This doesn't answer all the questions. I think we're going to it's going to take us a long time to answer all the questions. Can't we all just get along is a question. Are we at the point where we want to have communal conversation yet with people who may not agree with our positionality and our opinions? And what about people who don't and never will agree? I don't know the answer to that. What I think that Martin King tells us tonight is not to neglect our own unique particularities and the ways in which we have been formed and shaped by the divine and the experiences that we have had, so that we can proclaim and live the gospel as we understand it in the world that we've been called to. So the question I want to ask you is, who are you? Who tells your story? What is your story? How do you live and move in the world? And what distortions are there that you are called by the Spirit to ponder? Not only ponder, really, but to break through. The black preacher exemplar, Martin King, breaks through the distortions in his own bodily particularity. And one way we can combat the universalizing tendency, which flattens identity and subsumes it for the sake of a larger imperial narrative, is do not go gentle into that good night, but to proclaim from who we are, whether we are powered or not, the gospel as we understand it. This is a quote from Martin King. Have we not come to such an impasse in the modern world that we must love our enemies or else? The chain reaction of evil, hate begetting hate, wars producing more wars, must be broken, or else we shall be plunged into the dark abyss of annihilation. This is Impasse revisited. Perhaps impasse is not nowhere to go, but no other choice. And that begins with a love that is bound in recognizing each other's particularity. I'm finished. That's it. Okay. Thank you.
Well, you got your big thank you. Thank you so much. We have time for questions. So I'm going to run around with a mic looking like a unprofessional Oprah, and then y'all.
Okay.
Places where you want to take it further. Okay, let's breathe and absorb it first.
Oh.
Now, questions?
Have there been any moments that you've experienced in your congregation recently that you've been able to or like want to draw connections with what you just discussed in terms of like conversations that you've had or questions that folks have asked you, or just like any examples you want to share?
You mean around
What's happening currently politically and like Christian witness in that, and telling the truth and combating distortions, like anything like that? Kind of a broad question, I know.
Certainly. Yeah. This church is the closest church to the United States Capitol. 1 block over is the Supreme Court building. No exaggeration. It is the closest church to the Capitol. And so what we really wrestle with as preachers in that space is how much is enough and how much is too much, because it's in the water. It is the water of Capitol Hill, everything political. And if I don't say something about what's happening, then it's like, I thought you were going to say something about such and such. Now, I haven't really faced that, because I will tell you that being a black pastor with all white people at first was scary for me in terms of how much do I say and how comfortable can I get. And I just, it just got to the point one day where I said, y'all just going to have to fire me, but I need to say this, which is the piece about being true to one's particularity and not assimilating into the majority culture by being silent and also thereby complicit. So every week I try to be prophetic in my proclamation. I need to say that I have the privilege of doing that in a church like this, and not everybody has that privilege. And so we have to think then about what it means to preach subversively. I'll use Casey as an example. Casey preached in one of my classes, in the class last semester. After the election, after the election 2024, he got up and preached an entire sermon about Shirley Chisholm, the first black woman to run and lose an election, and what that meant. That's an example of subversive preaching. And that if you can't say what you need to say, there may be other ways to get at it without saying it. And that is a tool of resistance. Dr. Finch, don't ask me a hard question, please. I can't translate it. All right, I'm gonna stop being silly. Come on.
Thank you for your lecture. As I was listening to you describe the way King preaches, I was thinking about Otis Moss III's work on the Blue Note Gospel, and the way he beautifully articulates the artistry of black preaching. And I'm wondering if you could say something about the trauma that gives birth to the art of black preaching. And in light of that, and in light of what you've said about embodiment, is it possible to appropriate a black preaching style?
Thank you for the question. I think I come from the perspective that preaching should be art. It should be artistry. It should be something that we craft. It's not something that we just write down and do. So for instance, if you have your exegetical work, and even if you make the bridge from your exegetical work to your real life application, but it's hollow without any artistry, then it's a lecture. It's what I just did. The artistry born in the heart and soul of the black preacher is often imitated, but never duplicated. I will also say that there are people who have grown up. That's the noise he said was going to make. But I do think that there are some people who have grown up who are not necessarily African American in those contexts, and they have, because it's also said that black preaching is not taught, it's caught. So I think that there is something to be said about organically absorbing or picking it up. I can also say that when it is appropriated, no matter how beautiful it sounds, there's a thinness to it if it doesn't come with the weight of the human experience. Gardner Taylor would often say, this person such and such is a good preacher, but they ain't got no blood on their preaching. Meaning, human experience informs the artistry and the genius of this craft.
It's me next. Can I echo a sense of gratitude? That was utterly compelling. Thank you very much. I mean, one feature of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s preaching is, of course, the deep texture in the biblical tradition and those constant allusions. To what extent would you say that too, I mean, what's interesting is you focus more on the artistry and less on the sort of biblical content or even the theological content, save for your emphasis on social justice.
Sure.
So is there also a theme in terms of you're more likely to cite Exodus than Irenaeus, perhaps? You know, is that part of this tradition as well?
Absolutely. Go back to Cleo LaRue's Heart of Black Preaching. Black preaching, also historic. I'll say I didn't have time. I wish I could have. Y'all would have still been. We'd have been here 2 hours. But strong biblical content and the belief, hermeneutical again, interpretational, and a belief in a God that delivers become the two key hinge points of these Africans who are trying to make sense of this theology and break through those distortions. Strong biblical content. So Dr. King was very much a product of his day, and even now that continues to be a staple of black preaching. So that's why you'll have a lot of traditions of black preaching that are very much bibliocentric. Yeah, that's right. Bibliocentric. They're focused on the words, for better or for worse. That is a part of our tradition.
Thank you, Dr. Vandiver. I'm so grateful for your call to particularity. I wonder if you can, I'm going to risk a two-part question.
Oh, okay.
If you can give us a little bit more on your sense of the shape of impasse in this particular moment. What is the shape of impasse? And the second part, I couldn't help but thinking of two different visions of America in Black thought. One is Langston Hughes. America will be, this hopeful vision of an American project yet unfinished. King largely identifies with that version. There's another version, which there's many accounts of it, but I like Childish Gambino, This is America. Mm-hmm. That is not a hopeful vision, but a vision of the real destitution of this project that has meant death, Black death. So that's part of the, when I encounter our impasse today, is in part a choice between those two visions. And I wonder, drawing on that vision of King and your own Civ, help us feel our way into this, the impasse of this moment.
The shape of the impasse, I think, is indeed a competition for two Americas. And I think you can expand that vision beyond just blackness and black thought and black opinion. That's just really what it is, thinking about this narrative that is being released in front of us about close the Black Museum because it is valorizing principles that are only saying it's just for white people. I talked about that earlier. And then the narrative of the This Is America. I will say that I don't think anybody black was shocked when this stuff started happening. There might have been some, but like this notion of this project 2025 being rolled out. Oh, I'm not gonna use it. Or I'm gonna bring your price of eggs and stuff down right away. I don't think we were surprised with the shape of America, the shape of the impasse. What I think is happening is that since more people are affected by what is happening, people are wising up to this shape of this is America. And the choice is, will we go gentle into that good night and not speak, not act? Or will we work together to realize this new space of transformation? America the beautiful, oh, beautiful for spacious skies, all that stuff. It's nice in theory, but I don't know a lot of people that, where I'm from, that sing that song with full throats, I think it's more that this is America. Rising skepticism with glimmers of hope. Did that answer your question? Kind of? Yeah. I'm not a theologian or an ethicist. I'm just a preaching professor, so sorry if that.
Okay. This might be a personal question.
That's okay.
How do you maintain the particularity, the integrity of your particularity when consistently preaching in non-Black spaces that may re-traumatize, tokenize, or silence your lived experience? How do you maintain your particularity with that?
I worried about that when I took the call. I planted a church in a historic Black space in Harlem, and always felt that God was calling me to my people, so to speak. And I also try to be sensitive to the Spirit and felt like the Spirit was calling me to this church. How do I maintain that particularity? One, my wife is there with me. You can't do this work alone. And I surround myself with people who love me and support me, who are my tribe, that help me to remain filled and full. And I remain committed to raising my two little Black sons and teaching them the things. So finding ways to, no matter what, speak for them and for me, and telling my tribe that if it ever comes to the point where it seems like I'm slipping, you're gonna have to let me know. Because it's contagious. It lulls you to sleep. This notion and invitation to conform and assimilate and be quiet, because you all right. It's a thing. And I try to stay conscious of that.
I had told Charlie that I wasn't going to ask a question.
Look, you got hands up. Yeah, go ahead.
I have to apologize. But anyway, what I was hoping you could share with us is some guidance that you believe Dr. King would have, and also you, for white preachers that come from a particularity and have their own sieves to address distortions.
Mm-hmm. I'll refer you to the letter from the Birmingham jail, just summarized, where he was writing to his white Christian Jewish colleagues, about gradualism. You're moving too fast, pump the brakes. Basically, no, we're not going to wait. And how can you tell us to wait when we've been under this for so long? And how will you use your power to move the people towards transformation? Teaching white folks, preaching to white folks, right? You have power. I suggest that a lot of us have agency. But from a powered perspective, you speak truth to power the same way that we do, and use that power for good. That when it's easy to be comfortable, which we all struggle with, it's more difficult to speak out, but we have to do it together. We have to do it together. And whenever I teach preaching, there has to be a prophetic impulse. Why does this matter? Don't tell me what Aquinas said without telling me why it matters. Yeah? Put some shoe leather on your theology. Aren't y'all done asking questions?
No.
All right, okay.
Yes, over here, hi.
Yes.
I found your imagery of distortion very compelling, but it occurs to me that identifying distortions in your reality and addressing them is difficult work.
Yeah.
And I am curious about how you understand the role of pastoral care involved inside of this work with the people that you preach to.
As I said, I kind of have a privilege. My church is more progressive in nature, but we are invited as pastors and leaders to have the relevant conversations if people are willing to come to the table. We have to come to the table, though, with a set of rubrics on which we can all agree. What is your definition of the gospel? How can I help us approximate that as Jesus would have commanded us to do? And have those conversations. There was a training here that I've actually built into some of my presentations where Pink came and did like a multicultural training. And she talked about how to navigate pastorally across difference, where you say what's important to you and I mirror what's important to you, such that you will hopefully listen to why this thing is important to me. And while you may not fully agree with what I say, and I may not fully agree with what you say, the space is created for some kind of journeying together. So pastorally, I remind the people what Jesus said. What Jesus said. That's where I am right now. We got a long journey ahead, so I don't know what I'll tell you in 2 years, but that's kind of what I try to do. Bring us back to this set of values upon which we claim to agree.
Dr. Vandiver, thank you.
Wesley?
You've already started talking about this, but I want to, can you talk more about distortions? Because you talked about distortions in our country's history, and the last question was about distortions, but like the gospel is distorted. And so we can read the same lectionary passage and come up with supposedly or apparently two different truths. And can you speak more into that kind of, the distortion of Jesus himself?
Yeah, that's why I was trying to concede that weakest point at the very beginning in terms of interpretation, distortion as interpretation. Thank you for that question. And we can use in the lectionary upcoming for Sunday, the gospel passage, where Mary is anointing Jesus' feet at Bethany. Lazarus is at the table. Judas interrupts the scene and says, "You should have given that to the poor." And of course, he don't care about that. Jesus says to him, "The poor you will have with you always." And depending upon your set of heuristics, that determines how you interpret that passage. Why do we need to care for the poor? And then expand that. Who cares if we're snatching people off the streets? Jesus said, "The poor you will have with you always." And so the distortion is a real thing, and I don't know that we can really get away from it. What I can say is we combat the distortion with our particularity. That if we say nothing, the only narrative that will be out there is the distortion. And so that's why we are called to proclaim the gospel, so that there are at least other narratives by which we choose from. And then you decide, as the Spirit is working on you, because remember, you're not preaching by yourself. This is Spirit work. You decide, as the Spirit is conforming you to the image of Christ, which one you want to take. Yes. There's one right here.
Is that okay? Sure.
We'll pass it to you.
I'll pass it to her next. Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Vandiver. Richard Burridge, a former Dean of King's College London, which one of our alum is Dean Markham. The other one that that I've been thinking a lot about during the course of your lecture was Desmond Tutu. And I'm deeply grateful for what you've said tonight, and it's challenged and helped me enormously. But a word of explanation is that I had the privilege of working closely with Archbishop Desmond over 30 years. And when I was the Dean of King's, I also got to see his file, including his submission to do a doctorate at King's on black theology, which King's turned down because they didn't know there was such a thing.
Yeah.
And he was deeply influenced by Dr. King and by the movement here in America in the mid-60s when he was finishing up at King's, and was trying to work on what a black theology for South Africa would look like. And part of that was what you have said in terms of the deeply biblical basis. And for him, as for Dr. King, the Exodus narrative of people who are oppressed, being led by God through the wilderness, finally getting to a promised land. I mean, Dr. King's great speech, I may not get there with you, you know, and all that. And that was at the heart of a lot of Desmond Tutu's theology, which he had learned from Dr. King and from here. My problem was, as somebody who worked at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission with him and spent a long time trying to understand the Afrikaans version, was that when I learned Afrikaans and read Ratsvolk, Nazi, and Der Licht van den Skrif, which sounds very Nazi in the Afrikaans, but it means race, people, and nation in the light of Scripture. I found the same paradigm at the heart of Afrikaner theology. And that here was a group of Dutch farmers who were persecuted by the British, I will point out, who God led on a great trek through the wilderness to a promised land. And the irony is that black theology in both South Africa and here has that at its heart. Afrikaner theology has that at its heart. And I would respectfully suggest a large amount of American theology of people who were under persecution in Europe, who came here for a new world, and you see that in what you quoted from the Founding Fathers. How do we handle that issue of the same biblical narrative being used by people with, to use your point, a particular view in which we all want to be the hero. We all want to be, we're the persecuted ones and you're the oppressors. But for Desmond Tutu, for Martin Luther King, the emerging oppression of blacks were the children of God. For the Afrikaners, they were the children of God who had been persecuted by those horrible Brits. And for so many who came to here and were behind the Founding Fathers, they were the children of God who were escaping from persecution. How do those different particularities affect the readings of Scripture?
You had to show me British learning by asking me that question, that very complex question. No.
I'd love to hear what you have to say. I respect what you said so much.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's no secret. I'm coming back to American context, how the Ku Klux Klan, and all of the white supremacist groups think that they are God's chosen and also also the persecuted elect. And in that case, we have to go extra biblical. So, right, in terms of our analysis of the corresponding fruit, okay, what is the fruit of the organization which claims that it has been minoritized in some way? Versus, if you look at one group, you see the fruit of persecution, oppression of others, and then on the other side, you see people struggling to make it. I think it is the way that I evaluate it, but it is still yet a distortion from an observer's perspective. Because again, from an interpretational perspective, I can't tell you what you believe about yourself, but I can call to account what you have done. What you have done. I guess that's the best way I can.
Thank you. That's the conclusion I came to, but I'm delighted to hear you say.
Oh, thank you.
So I think the next question will have to be the last one, and the gift that we have is chapel class lunch. So you can grab Dr. Vandiver at lunch and continue to ask questions.
Okay.
So sorry about that.
Yeah. So my question is, first I want to thank you for your beautiful presentation. And it's not a question, just I want to hear your particular experience being a Lutheran pastor. You have another Luther in your life and your Black identity. So how, in the everyday reality, how these two Luther to one another in your heart and in your life? That's the first question I have. And the other question I have is about the trauma-informed preacher. From a pastoral care perspective, the trauma has a stage, right? There is a post-trauma or traumatic experience.
Yes.
And there is also a possibility to heal.
Sure.
Because if this trauma-informed preacher is being informed by the trauma and preaching from that space, there is a lack of reflexivity. Mm-hmm. But when nation states or preachers or churches, when they have a space to tell their story, there is a stage that will come for that people, for that nation, to know that, okay, we were affected by racism and it needs to end, right? So there is that kind of healing.
Yes.
So in this nation, Martin Luther being killed, being traumatized and dying for the gospel, and people continued preaching. Have you seen this post-traumatic stage, this nation coming together after telling the story? This is time for us to heal, or still in that trauma stage. So,
Sure.
and then I don't want also from my point of view to essentialize the trauma. It's like essentializing the risks and the racism that's happening. We need to say no to that.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Mala. First question, how's it been being a Lutheran pastor? I was ordained in the Metropolitan New York Synod that probably had the most Black American pastors next to Philadelphia in the entire country. The ELCA, Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, is, according to 2018 Pew Research report, the widest denomination, whitest denomination in America. It is largely an ethnic religion where it grew through means of procreation. And so when the ELC was founded in the late 80s, they wanted to have a 10% quota of Black pastors within 10 years. Failed miserably at that, and mistreated a lot of people in the process. And so when I came in, I heard the terror and the trauma of stories, mostly of Black women, because they were mostly Black pastors in New York, who had endured all manner of trauma. And they saw me coming up and wrapped their arms around me and protected me, such that I didn't endure the same kind of beating that they had gone through in their own calls. So that's the answer to your first question in terms of, yeah, and thank you for that piece about trauma, and I neglected to mention it. Trauma it's painful, and it comes at a tremendous cost. It also is a tremendous cost to ask this body to participate in the transformation. But also feels like at some point, we don't necessarily have a choice. But there are prices to be paid. Are we at a post-traumatic moment? No, I don't think so. I don't think we're there yet, for sure. I think that the hermeneutical container, which is Black preaching, the formulaic nature and design, the genius of it, was solidified in that crucible of suffering and passed down over generations. So I think that it is hardwired and hard-baked into our conceptualization of what it means to preach. Is it at the same place that it was after Reconstruction, after chattel slavery? Of course not. We've seen some progression, but we are still in a moment of active trauma. Active trauma where Black preachers are preaching in white spaces and Black preachers are preaching in Black spaces. Everybody's in a traumatic moment, honestly. But the hope of the gospel as we understand it leads us to keep preaching to create that moment of upheaval, I think. Does that answer your question? I have hope, though. Mm-hmm. Okay, that's it. Come on. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm going to take the privilege of having the mic to say, let us remember the post-traumatic syndrome is not linear. Post-traumatic, that whole process is not linear. And every time that it is re-triggered, it is the same traumatic experience again. So we might be in a post-traumatic moment, but that doesn't mean that the trauma ceases. Anyway, my 3 cents. We have a lovely reception outside for you to enjoy. He's hostage. He is here in the person. Maybe that was a poor choice of words, but the brother is here in the flesh. Y'all can continue to ask questions if you don't exhaust him too much. And then there's always lunch. Thank you so much. And thank you again, Dr. Vandiver, for all your work.